I haven't done a 2-minute talk about Beethoven before. I did a talk once on one of his pieces, this so-called Moonlight Sonata, but so far the man's life has remained relatively untouched. I could fill many 2-minute talks with stories of Beethoven's life, and I will. But today we're doing a countdown of sorts. We're talking about the 10 most unfortunate facts about Beethoven, the man who wrote the Moonlight Sonata, the Fifth Symphony, and the Ode to Joy. Number 10. Beethoven was born when Mozart was huge. Come on, all of Europe was chanting Mozart's name when Beethoven was born. They were all swooning over this little boy who was said to be the most kissed boy in all of Europe. He had the entire continent talking. He was memorizing music and performing and composing at a ridiculously young age. He had set the bar pretty high. Number 9. Beethoven's father was just plain mean. Johann van Beethoven is not someone you'd want as your father. He had a real alcohol problem. He was a tenor who would go out to bars at night and then come home drunk, force his son to practice so he could be just like Mozart, and when Ludwig made a mistake, he was beaten. Number 8. Beethoven had a bad attitude. There are so many stories of Beethoven's temper, his insults, his uncontrollable rage. Beethoven was someone who was very hard to get along with, and he was unapologetic about it. Number 7, he thought he was a Greek god. So Beethoven had this enormous ego, and whereas composers before him saw themselves as servants, either of the church or around aristocracy, Beethoven really saw himself as an artist who was going to be made immortal through his art, and this kind of thing was unheard of. The part about where he calls himself a Greek god is a quote in which he says, "Music is the wine which inspires one to new generative processes, and I am Bacchus who presses out this glorious wine for mankind and makes them spiritually drunk." Number 6, he didn't impress Haydn. Around the time of his 20th birthday, Beethoven went to study with Haydn. Haydn found Beethoven very arrogant. Beethoven would have not been easy to teach, and the relationship quickly soured between the two of them. Number 5, Beethoven had to try to continue composing for 30 years after his hearing started to fail. The story of Beethoven going deaf is kind of infamous now. He suffered for years with this sort of pseudo-hearing in which he'd hear only certain frequencies, or he'd hear buzzing and ringing in his head. He was both horrified and ashamed of what was happening to him, and this ends up being one of the most famous, one of the most talked about stories in all of classical music, how Beethoven continued to compose despite his hearing loss.